Namaste, everybody. Crucial to know your enemies very well. Likewise, it is very important to know the weaknesses of your instrument. Only that way can you try to make amendments, modify your handling, or maybe even invent better instruments. In this episode, we will explore what I think are the major weaknesses of the long Bansuris. Let me add again that all instruments have their own weaknesses, and in no way whatsoever am I demeaning the Bansuri as it currently exists, and all the wonderful music it is capable of providing, and all the superb Bansuri players of past and present. This is really only a theoretical and critical analysis of the Bansuri, and we want to see if any of this analysis, theoretical analysis, can be put into practical effect by perhaps inventing a better Bansuri. The comments here mainly pertain to longer Bansuris, such as the E-bass Bansuri, which has gained the most popularity for Hindustani concert music performances. The issues I'm presenting are less with shorter Bansuris or with Carnatic flutes, purely because of the instrument length. Shorter length flutes have different weaknesses. My efforts at developing Bansuris and new fingering mechanisms have been directed towards addressing these weaknesses. In future episodes, starting with the next one, I will demonstrate new Bansuris and new fingerings that I have developed that have tried to address the concerns presented here. In episode 3, we discuss some of the most important properties involving tone holes and finger mechanics. This episode will discuss 8 of the most important weaknesses I have identified in relation to those particular properties. Only 6 fingers are traditionally used. In episode 3, we saw how we're not using some of our most flexible fingers. Can we not come up with a tone hole and fingering system that makes more optimal use of our hand and fingers? Our little fingers are very flexible. Can we not make better use of them than let them sort of just dangle in the air? Can our strong, flexible thumbs not be used for more than just supporting the instrument? Holding a long Bansuri to cover all the 6 holes without any air leaks is quite strainful at the beginning. It takes time to develop the ease of handling it. That is why beginners are told to start with a shorter Bansuri. For all players, from beginners to professionals, the fingers require stretching. We saw in episode 3 how the fingers work best when they're most relaxed. And that usually means when they're close to each other. With the current fingering system, relaxation takes time to develop and is never really completely achieved. Thin-walled Bansuris, such as this one, which is a sort of a typical Assam bamboo, which is used for concert in Hindustani classical music, which is the sort of the preferred bamboo. These thin-walled Bansuris are harder to hold than thicker ones, such as these. In episode 3, it was shown that the distance between the thumb and the rest of the fingers is a crucial factor here for comfort-wise. With the thinner bamboos, since the outer diameter of the tube is smaller, this brings the thumb closer to the fingers. In the diagram here, the one on the left is this one, the typical Assam bamboo flute, which has got pretty thin wall, about roughly 2 millimeters thick. This one, the thicker one, is the one on top and has a wall thickness of roughly 4 millimeters, a little more than that. The thinner ones cramps up the fingers and it makes it harder to stretch the fingers out. Carbon fiber bansuris are generally even thinner than thin bansuris, making it even more difficult to hold. Generally, the carbon fiber tubes that I work with have a thickness of 1 millimeter. There is a simple solution to handling these thinner bamboos or the very thin carbon fiber tubes that makes it much easier to handle. In a future episode, I will show you what kind of solutions we can do to make it really easy. In episode 3, we've also demonstrated that a note produced by half opening a tone hole is always weaker than a note produced by a fully open tone hole, and that the problem gets worse the further away the tone hole is from the blowhole. It weakens not only the volume but also the tonal quality. So the weakest note in the Bansuri is the komal da, especially in the Mandrasthai or the Mandrasaptak komal da. Yet this is such an important note in rags such as Bhairav, Bhairavi, Darbari Kannada, Malghosh, Todi, and many others. Just watch some of the professionals play this note. Even they struggle with it and often do some adjustments to the blowing and or tilting the bansuri to get the sufficient volume. Have you ever considered what among the 12 notes in a saptak are the most important ones? One way to define importance is how frequently is a particular note played. It is obvious that sa and pa are the most frequent notes. They set the baseline for the other notes, and it is these two notes that one hears mostly from a tampura. Sa occurs in all the rags. Pa appears in almost all of them. Which is the next most important one? It is Shuddhma. This note is almost always a resting and a sustaining note in many of the most widely played rags, and often the most important note in rags such as Khamaj and Malghosh. In Indian music, all the notes have a simple frequency ratio to the sa. Pa, for example, has the simplest frequency ratio of 3/2. The next simplest frequency ratio is 4/3, and this is represented by Shuddhma. So it is not surprising that Shuddhma is such a frequent note. Yet in the traditional fingering system, the Shuddhma is produced by half closing the top hole. We saw previously that half closing always weakens a note, volume and tone-wise. The Shuddhma does not have a tone hole for itself, yet it so richly deserves one. The Tivrma has one whole open tone hole, and yet it is not played as frequently. And also, the Tivrma is rarely a resting and sustaining note. That is because it is a much more complicated fraction related to the base sa. It is almost always associated with another note, such as the pa, pancham above, or the ga or the re below, even in such rags as Yaman. The Bansuri, of course, is a type of cylinder or tube. The holes burnt or drilled on it naturally follow the curvature of the tube. The curvature is very useful and necessary for the blowhole because it makes it easier to adjust the blow angle and produce a sound. When it comes to tone holes, however, there are two fundamental issues. The first issue is that it takes time to close the fingers, which have to wrap around the hole to close it properly. The wrapping around is usually done by the flesh in the fingers. Let me just demonstrate. Here's a flat rubber piece. If I close the hole like that, just closing it, just making contact with the hole doesn't close it properly because you can see some air leakage. The rubber has to wrap around the hole, and that's what the finger flesh does on trying to close the hole. On the other hand, if the holes did not have the curvature, then here, so this is the end of a long tube, then the closure is immediate. When I say it takes time, I'm talking about a small fraction of a second here. Let's be realistic. But this itself can make a difference in responsiveness, especially in very quick passages. The second issue is air leakage. If the finger closing a tone hole is perpendicular to the length of the flute, for example here, this finger is perpendicular to the length of the flute, at right angles to the length of the flute, then there should not be a problem with air leakage unless the finger has hardly any cushioning flesh, or it is smaller than the tone hole, which can happen if the tone hole is too large or if a small kid is trying to play on it. However, if the tone hole is approached at an angle, for example, like this finger or this finger, then there's an additional wrapping process which takes a little longer, and the risk of air leakage is also greater. In episode 3, it was mentioned that the fingertips are the most sensitive part of a finger, and it makes sense for that to be used mostly in closing the holes. Additionally, using fingertips provides the greatest leverage impact, which means that you have to move the fingers less to open and close a tone hole. This in turn means faster movement and less finger strain. Let us examine the two predominant methods of holding a flute, a E-based concert Bansuri in Hindustani classical music today. On the left, you have Pandit Hariprasad Chaurasia ji, and on the right you have Pandit Rajendra Prasanna ji. Look at the differences in the method of holding. Hariprasad ji has a thumb that is a little away from the forefinger. Prasanna ji has his thumb comes under the forefinger here. With Hari Prasad ji's method of holding the flute, only the ring finger of both hands close the tone holes at their tips. The others are somewhere, along the fingers. With Prasanna ji's holding the flute, holding the Bansuri, only two fingers do not use the fingertips to close the tone holes, and those are these two. This uses the fingertips, and all three fingers use the fingertips. So these are two different methods of holding the Bansuri. The eighth point concerns the thumb hole that some Bansuri players use. In the traditional six-tone hole Bansuri, there is a discontinuity between Tivrama and Pa. It is very difficult to achieve a perfectly smooth glide between Pa and any of the lower notes. So many important rags rely on these glides. For example, the glide between Pa and Ga in Bhopali, or between Ma and Pa in Komal Ga in Darbari Kannada. Some flutists today have introduced an additional Panchama thumb hole to overcome this deficiency. This is indeed a very welcome addition. The school that uses the thumb hole mostly is the Godkinde school, and there the thumb placement is closer to Pandit Hari Prasad ji's. Personally, because of my bone structure perhaps, and partly because it makes possible more use of fingertips. I prefer Pandit Prasannaji's placement, but this makes use of the thumb hole almost impossible, unless there are some major changes to the method of holding. This we shall see in a future episode. As we shall see in later episodes, more use can also be made of this Pancham thumb hole than currently being used. Thank you. Next, I will introduce a concept Bansuri that I have been working on that tries to overcome the weaknesses mentioned in this episode. This concept Bansuri has many innovations, so many that I have decided to introduce it in 3 different parts, parts A, B, and C. Stay tuned.